There he is.
There we go. A long time no see, Dr.
My
Helms.
man. My man. It's been since April when I was in Mexico. How you doing?
April, indeed. I'm doing really well. I've been starstruck by your latest posts and stories and such. Man, such great content you're putting out lately.
I'm trying. It just took us going out to Texas and running around all over, meeting greats like Ronnie Coleman and
Yeah,
leading researchers like Grant Tinsley and exploring our wonderful history at the Stark Center. So yeah, pretty cool.
yeah, and it's pretty crazy to see you with Ronnie Coleman and also the post that it was a post or a series of stories, I think, that you measured your body fat and it ranged between, if I recall correctly, 8 to 17, something like that. And it's very crazy because that's something I talk a lot about with my students, and to see you talk about that, really interesting, man.
Yeah, we went to Texas Tech where Dr. Grant Tinsley has probably the most advanced body composition lab in North America that specifically does like applied research in resistance strain populations. And of course, the dude is an avid lifter himself. He's got bigger arms than I do. And we did 9 different ways of estimating my body composition. They've done some really great methodological work. One of their studies, which is really cool, is they bought like 15 different home bioimpedance scales
Yeah.
and compared them against all the stuff they have there. So I got to step on the most accurate of the low, mid, and high price point scales. And on the most accurate of the low price point scales, I was 17% body fat.
Yeah, obviously not.
Yeah. And then on the most accurate, or I should say, it has the best agreement with lab-based tests. Most expensive, top of the line one, I think I was like 9% or something like that. I can't quite remember.
Also,
Um, yeah, based upon DEXA, I was 8.3%. So I had a range of 8.3 all the way to 17. Based upon their 6 compartment model, where they compile their BIS, which is multi-frequency bioimpedance spectroscopy. And when I say multi-frequency, I mean like 256 frequencies. So it's a much more advanced device. They use a 3D body scanner to get your volume. They use BodPod or air displacement plethysmography. And they combine all those together to get a 6 compartment model, which I didn't even know existed until I was there. So it gives you your bone mineral content, I think your mineral content in other tissues, so like blood. It gives you glycogen. It gives you your protein content. It gives you your fat content, water, and that's the most accurate. And I think that had me at a low 10% body fat, and DEXA had me at 8.3. And I was just barely under the dehydration cutoff. So Grant actually thinks that DEXA is probably a little more accurate. So that's not just me trying to find the lowest number, but probably means that at this point I'm somewhere between 8 to 9% body fat.
yeah,
So,
and
but
also based on looks, it totally makes sense.
it's the
I mean,
only thing that matters,
yeah,
right? Is like
yeah,
I'm not going to get
bodybuilding.
on stage and they're not going to be like competitor number 6. What's your body fat percentage? They're just gonna look at me.
17, they're
Yeah,
gonna go. Thank you, man.
exactly,
And
exactly.
and and by the way, does that measure that their Celtic content also? Not
I
to running
mean,
and
yeah, the cell tech content, yeah, like how much anabolics are in your blood floating around. Yeah, that's right.
man, that was such epic moment. It's like two worlds colliding in the same world of bodybuilding. So thanks a lot for that happening. I'm also really looking forward for the Iron Culture documentary. It's gonna be awesome.
We're so excited about it. Yeah, for anyone who's wondering why the hell was I running around in Texas, that's something that Omar and I are doing as a passion project. Is what started as our podcast in early 2019, late 2018, themed around history, science, and culture. We're now going to locations where there's either cultural icons, historical meaning, or there is really good science being done, and basically doing a documentary, interviewing them. So this is our second big trip of filming. The last one was in the British Isles. We were in Ireland and the UK. We filmed at the Sheffield, where I was coaching, which is the big first huge invitational money meet of the champions. We got
Oh
to
yeah,
coach.
yeah. So
We got to
so
coach Jess Bittner there, which is pretty cool. Jesus Olivares put up the biggest total ever in raw powerlifting, even though he was a tested athlete, even though he's in his early 20s. Just wild. And then from there, we went to Solent University, hooked up with Dr. Pack, Milo, now Dr. Milo Wolf, and also Dr. James Steele, who are doing really great research in length and partial kind of positions, along with a lot of other really cool applied stuff. And then finally, we went with Dr. Connor Heffernan, who invited us to see Hercules Gym, the oldest continuously open gym in all of Europe, which is in Dublin.
Awesome.
We interviewed members who are in their 70s as well as those in their 20s. And finally, we went to find some of the newly rediscovered Irish lifting stones that go back sometimes centuries and sometimes even longer, going back to the very earliest kind of ancient culture of Ireland and the strength that's been there for a long time. So lots of cool stuff, man.
Which brings us to the very important question and subject matter of getting as big as possible, of getting jacked, of getting all the attention in the gym. You know what I'm talking about. And check my how do you call it? The segue. Check my segue to the topic.
That's right.
I've been practicing them.
Irish lifting sounds amazing. So how do I get bigger biceps? Yeah.
That there's something, you see, it's I've been practicing, as you can see.
You're killing it.
I had this conversation recently with actually Milo Wolf, which I think has one of the coolest names ever, man. Milo Wolf, as you can say it. It's imposing, to say the least. And also, I heard about this topic, this long muscle and partials, first because of MAS, which is disponible en español. MAS en español está disponible. Link in the description, link in the description. It's an honor to be a part of MAS, man. That's the first time I heard of it. And I thought I didn't understand correctly partials. I mean, what do you mean partials? I think it was a review by Greg at that time. And left me wondering, what do you mean by long muscle lengths? And several studies came up, and now we have the meta-analysis by Milo, and also your article in MAS, which I think lets me to believe, we might have something here of interest, which I think we briefly discussed the last time we spoke on Instagram, just maybe as a side joke or something like that. But to dig deep into this topic, I think it's important to understand what is actually a full range of motion, and is the evidence of full range of motion and hypertrophy as solid as one might think? Because it actually might not be, right?
Yeah, this is an interesting thing because it's been fun for me because over the last maybe 5 or 6 years, my perspective has changed as more and more data has come out, and people have done a great job at communicating that data, like people who are doing a PhD on this topic, like Milo. He's leading the charge. And we've always kind of had this perception that full range of motion is better. You're training, there's a lot of arguments for it. You're each rep is lasting longer, you're getting more volume, you're training maybe better regional hypertrophy across the whole spectrum of it. And it might be better for functional outcomes, et cetera, but there was no really solid data on it that had been compiled. But there was a Schoenfeld review specifically on comparing short versus full range of motion. And in the discussion, there was a little piece there that said, overall, we did find that full range of motion was better for hypertrophy. However, it was most consistently found when that full range of motion included training muscles at longer lengths. So it makes you wonder, and I'm paraphrasing of what the authors wrote, is this actually an effect of full range of motion? Or is it because the full range of motion in these comparisons typically includes training at a long muscle length? It's a traditional way of comparing a partial range of motion to a full range of motion might be doing, like, say, a half squat to a full squat. But what had never been compared was, say, doing the bottom half of a squat, not coming up all the way, not locking out, like a lot of bodybuilders intuitively do, interestingly enough, versus a full range of motion squat. So what's really being compared is potentially different levels of tension, So, and I used to think, it wouldn't matter because you do a half squat, you don't go all the way down. You can lift heavier loads, so it kind of makes up for it. But it does seem to be there's some effect of actually the length of the target muscles that they're being trained at. And so that was the first hint, was that review. And then from there was multiple lines of research that really started to paint the picture of the importance of the muscle length you're training at. So I can go through all of those, or if you got specific questions, you let me know. I can monologue if I'm left alone to my own devices. So,
It will be awesome to go through several of those because I know for some, the last one, the Casiano, which
mhm.
was for the gastrocnemius, showed greater benefit than the meta-analysis did. So and also we don't know still if this does apply to all muscle groups. So I think it's important to talk about
Mhm.
each specific study and its own limitations, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think, yeah, going through this is kind of, I'll walk people through like what I saw. So this has been compared a number of different ways. And when you think about this question, it's kind of hard to isolate the variable of muscle length versus range of motion. And some of the ways that I think this was done pretty elegantly was by one standout study by Mao and colleagues. So this is not comparing length and partials, but it's comparing two different full range of motion variations of the same exercise that are independently changing the variable of muscle length. So Mao, a couple of years back, compared lying leg curls versus seated leg curls. So if you just think about the anatomy of the muscle, when you're in hip flexion in a seated leg curl, you're actually stretching your hamstrings, the sit and reach test, right? And when you're in a lying leg curl position, while you're still getting the same range of motion about the knee, the same amount of knee flexion as you would in a seated leg curl, you're just not as stretched. And the interesting thing they found was that for the heads of the hamstring that attach at the hip, they got greater hypertrophy doing seated leg curls versus lying leg curls. But even more so than that, a really other interesting finding was that the sartorius, which is also a knee flexor, a weak knee flexor, that actually attaches at the front of the hip, right? So it's actually more stretched when you're in a lying position rather than a seated position. It grew more from lying hamstring curls. So now we've isolated the effect of muscle length independent from range of motion with this study. And we've seen that, yes, even though the same number of degrees of knee flexion, you see greater growth in the muscles that are training at a longer muscle length. So this is the first time where we understand, oh, muscle length is important, right?
Right.
Now, even from here, my hypothesis would have been that, okay, well, if you do a full range of motion or a partial range of motion, but you're doing it in a lengthened position, you get the same outcome because both of them include that lengthened position. So I was wrong, because after that, now we've had a series of studies, and like you intimated, a meta-analysis, although it's a small meta-analysis, that have found that when you only do a partial range of motion and focus all of your efforts on that lengthened position, you get greater hypertrophy. So one notable study is Pedrosa and colleagues, where they had a bunch of different groups doing different ranges of motion on a leg extension. And the one that grew the most and grew the most consistently in all regions was the group that was just doing like the bottom portion of a leg extension, not coming up all the way. And shortly behind it was one that did the bottom and the top, but not the middle. And both of those groups outperformed or performed similarly to the one that did the full range. But pretty clearly, the one that performed the best, got the greatest hypertrophy, was the group doing the length and partial. So that was a quadriceps study. And that's continued. There's been other studies that have come out, and probably the most recent one is Casiano, exactly what you described, where they were doing calf raises on a leg press. One group just doing basically the bottom portion of it. So they were going from being in a dorsiflexed position up to until their foot was basically at a 90-degree angle with their ankle. And the other group was starting from that point and just doing kind of the lockout. And it was like almost a factor of 2 greater hypertrophy in the group that was doing the length and partial compared to the full range group that did both, and way more than the group that only did the partial shortened position. So, and these aren't the only studies. There's also some data on the arms now. And there's a coming study now that did a study on the glutes using essentially what sounds like from the conference abstract, a multi-hip device that you might see at the gym, doing a partial range of motion, like single leg hip extension versus a full range in a lengthened position, or the full range and a shortened. And at least from that conference presentation, so again, has not been peer reviewed yet, it seems that lengthened partials also seem to work for the glutes, which I think is an important thing, because I have heard some people claim that because of its architecture, maybe the glutes wouldn't respond that way, or maybe the delts wouldn't respond that way. But right now, we've got data in the quads, we've got data in the hamstrings, we've got data in the calves, we've got data in the arms, and we've got data in the glutes that all suggest that muscle length is an important variable, that either doing a lengthened partial or manipulating the position of the exercise so that you're having more tension in a lengthened position, whether you do a partial or not, does seem to enhance the effect of the exercise. So it's becoming clearer each time something gets published. And at this stage, I am, optimistic as far as this being something that will be a consistent finding. So it's pretty cool.
And several things came to mind. I think the first one that you talked about, the glutes, is the recent study about comparing squats versus hip thrust, which I know it's not a study designed to compare long and short muscle lengths, but still, with the squats in the lengthened position, we see pretty much equal growth as in the hip thrust in the shortened position. So that lets me to the second part of my question. I hope I phrased this correctly because there are a lot of things in my head. Stretch-mediated hypertrophy, and also, speaking of which, just stretching like you did with your calves. How can all these things connect together? Do we have any possible mechanisms? I never seen it in person. looks rather painful.
Absolutely, I'm into ankle SBD, so yeah, or BSDM or whatever it's called. I'm not even sure.
It's all that, I'm sure. So I hope I'm being clear with my question and where I'm trying to go from here. But what would be the difference between all this data we have? Let's say long muscle length partials and stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And do you think this lets us to believe that it's just the stretch? And what would be the difference between active and passive tension in all of this puzzle?
Great question. So the first thing I want to do, just a little bit of a divergence on the hip thrust versus squat study, because you're right, there's been a number of people who have interpreted this as a long versus short muscle length study. And while it is true that the hip thrust and the squat do train the glutes at different lengths, you don't get as deep into hip flexion at the bottom of a hip thrust compared to the squat. And the fact that they produce similar hypertrophy is like, oh, interesting. Maybe this doesn't apply to the glutes. But from a methodological perspective, I think it's really important to understand that there's more being compared when you train two different exercises than just the muscle length. So for example, these participants in this study, great study by Plotkin and colleagues, it's still a preprint, you can read it for free. And these untrained participants, which I don't think is it doesn't discount the study findings. It's just an important thing to remember. When they're going to failure, they are probably going to have a weak link in their chain in a squat. One of the muscle groups in a multi-joint exercise, if it can no longer meet the loading demands, it will be the limiting factor when you train to failure. So most of the time in a squat, it's probably going to be the quads. Not always, but one thing you will see as people train to failure in a squat is they start to shift it more into a good morning as they get closer and closer to failure. So they're shifting the load away from the knee and towards the hip to where they still have some energy left. And I think more often than not, when you're hitting failure in a squat, you can't think in your mind, oh, this is an equal relative effort or proximity to failure on a muscle-to-muscle basis between the glutes, the quads, the erectors, and the willpower, because we know taking squats to failure is pretty hard, right? So failure is more of kind of a collective occurrence of just their overall kind of systemic fatigue. And hip thrusts are very different. So the interesting thing about Plotkin's findings was that hip thrusts basically only hypertrophied the glute max. Didn't see much hypertrophy in the quadriceps, the adductors, glute medius or minimus, or the hamstrings. So they're very targeted. So we can be pretty sure that when you're training to failure on a hip thrust, it's going to produce failure in the glutes. So perhaps, and it could be any other reason, the reason why we saw similar growth in these two groups is because there was effectively a closer proximity to failure for the glutes specifically. They were training at a higher intensity, if you will, in the hip thrust, but they were further from failure in the squat, even though they were trained at a longer muscle length and kind of producing similar effects. So because of those confounding factors, really the only way you can actually experimentally check whether a muscle group responds better to a longer muscle length is to compare the same exercise. And fortunately, we actually have two other studies that have done that. There's the one I mentioned earlier, the conference abstract that hasn't gone through peer review. So, feel free to remain skeptical, where they compared full range of motion, isolated hip extension versus lengthened partials. And the lengthened partials did better by Mao. But there's also a study by Kubo and colleagues where it compared squats versus squats. So Kubo compared basically doing partial squats versus full range of motion squats, and the full range of motion squats produced greater glute hypertrophy, indicating that as you get deeper in a squat and the glutes are more stretched, they're going to get a better training effect, and you're controlling for that potential difference between exercises. So the data actually does indicate that even the glutes respond in this way. So it seems to be a non-muscle specific effect at this stage, counter to what some people have claimed. So now to answer the actual question you asked, what do we think is the mechanism? That's still an open question, because it's not super clear why this is the case. But ultimately, what we think is going on is that when you're training at a longer muscle length, there's greater mechanical tension. The actual sarcomeres are in a more stretched position. And the way the actual tension is sensed, there's mechanosensors within the muscle and also within the tendon. We have what's called costomeres, which are these protein molecules which create lateral force transmission. And we also have the titin molecule, which is kind of what anchors the actin and myosin heads to the cytoskeleton, if we're talking about the actual sarcomere, if you were to look at a muscle physiology textbook. And when you're in a deeper position or a muscle is more lengthened, there's going to be higher degrees of elastic tension on all three of those potential sites of mechanosensors. And there are probably more mechanosensors. We are actually still just scratching the surface of muscle physiology and understanding some of the mechanisms for inducing hypertrophy. So I think it's premature if anyone is claiming they have an understanding of exactly why long muscle length training produces this effect. And then also, like you mentioned, there is active and passive tension, right? So is training at a longer muscle length, while it does train me in a more stretched position, is that the same thing as doing long duration static stretching? And the answer is probably yes and no. So a whole other line of research, although tangentially related, is the recent data that's come out on static stretching. So there's no active contraction and the impact on hypertrophy. So there is a student in Germany who I believe is probably finishing his PhD pretty soon, just based upon the number of publications he's done. But Wernicke and colleagues has produced a whole bunch of studies on long duration, high intensity, high frequency static stretching of the gastrocnemius of the calf. And typically what they're doing is using a very similar orthotic device, that boot that I have, that fits on, my heel goes here, my toes are here, this straps onto my ankle, and you tighten these straps and it pulls you into dorsiflexion. And if you look at the studies, what they did is they got them to an 8 out of 10 stretch pain sensation. And you have to hold that for an hour every day. And then they would compare the stretched calf versus the non-stretched calf. So I did this for 12 weeks to see how it impacted.
Every day, Monday to Sunday?
6 days per week. 6 days per week. I took one day off just because I was also resistance training on top of it. And I didn't want to be like, hey guys, guess what happened? I tore my Achilles tendon. So we thought we'd be a little conservative compared to the Wernicke protocol. Interestingly enough, we did observe some changes. Now, the study of me is a little bit different than the Wernicke designs. Obviously, I'm just one person. So how do you methodologically tell anything from that? How do you know it's not my training? How do you know it's the boot? Also, what am I comparing myself to? And I was unwilling to just train one calf because I'm competing in bodybuilding this year. So I did both. So I was actually doing 2 hours per day because my lazy ass didn't buy two of these. So I would have to dedicate 2 hours of sitting on my butt, which is fine because most of my days end with Netflix with the wife. Barb and I, we're watching TV and I'm like, oh, uncomfortable and shit. Needless to say, it's extremely painful. So
yeah, you did it like that? 8 out of 10 discomfort?
I did.
A little bit more, a little bit less.
So that actually builds in progressive overload, interestingly enough, because each time you do it, you get a little more flexible. That was by far the most notable change in Wernicke and in myself, is that there's a good test called the knee to wall test. It's very practical.
Yeah.
You have to keep your heel down, and you actually have an experimenter holding a rubber band that you're pushing down with your heel. So the rubber band pops out, you know you've actually lifted your heel, and then you're just trying to push your knee forward towards a wall, and you're standing on a tape measure, so you can see your actual, number of centimeters of how far you can stretch. And that increased a lot, like 20-30%, if I recall correctly, over the course of the study. And yeah, I was able to get deep into squats, deep into leg press. There's some, interesting benefits there. But so the way you can actually tell change in a single individual is you have to figure out what is your typical variation. So what we did was for 4 weeks in a row, we measured me on the same day in the same conditions, relative to my training, and we assessed my ultrasound muscle thickness of my calf. And we went, look, this is before I'm stretching. So this is just my normal training. And we wouldn't expect someone who's been training for 19 years to really have much change over a 4-week period. So the variation between those 4 testing points, we went, okay, that's your typical variation. So the distance between the lowest and the highest point, we could consider anything more than that is a real change, either loss of muscle thickness or increase. And then what I did, since I was doing both calves, is we just compared, were my calves increasing more than that range? So this is one of the methods with a case study, a single study design, of being able to tell if there was a meaningful change. The downside of this is obviously we can't extrapolate this study to the general population. This is a study that tells us how do you grow Eric Helms' calves. So if you're ever in a position where you need that information, you're going to love this case study. But more. The real point is that we're looking at a very well-trained individual who is eking out marginal gains, and can stretching act as a novel stimulus and produce gains. And I will tell you that right now, the preliminary results, the answer is yes. And that was done on top of my calf training, which is pretty interesting. So I was doing 20 sets of calf raises per week, and then I tacked on, an hour per day, 6 days per week. And we did see not a huge change, but a real change, which I think is worth pointing out. So that's kind of a summary. We are currently going to submit that case study probably in the next month or so.
That's super interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in several studies involving animal models, that's how they induce hypertrophy, right? By stretching. Because how can you train, let's say, a rat or a bird?
Exactly. So there are some training models with animals. They typically, it's kind of messed up. I can never do animal research, but like, for example, you'll put an animal in water and they'll tread water, right? So you're forcing them to swim, and then you can even weight them in water, so they're forced to swim. You can also basically put them on a treadmill that they can't get off of, or like a treadmill ladder, right? And then they will climb, and then you just put different weights on them. So there are animal training models. They're all kind of, not PETA approved by any means. Or the other way that has been done, and this has been done primarily with avian models or birds, is weighting the wing. And they do it constantly, not an hour per day, but for weeks, 24 hours a day. And the amount of hypertrophy you see in these animal models is bonkers. So Wernicke did a meta-analysis of all the different animal models looking at long duration static stretching. And the way you quantify things in statistics when you're trying to do it without a specific unit, like say centimeters or whatever, is what's called the standardized mean change. And the standardized mean change is typically, or standardized mean difference is typically evaluated on a scale where 0.2 is considered a small effect, 0.5 is considered a moderate effect, and 0.8 or higher is large. And the changes were like not 0.8, they were like 4 or 5. So like they were technically large, but we're talking like 8-fold what is considered a large effect. So huge amounts of hypertrophy from constantly weighting limbs. So it's interesting because you're increasing muscle thickness and also sarcomeres and series, and you're basically seeing the tissue adapt to this constant loading stimulus. Now, obviously, that's never been done in humans. Ethically can't be done in humans, and probably wouldn't even be a good thing, like the type of hypertrophy you'd get, but it shows that it is plausible and has been observed. So the closest thing that's ethically doable is exactly what Wernicke's done, is these 6 to 8 week studies, typically 6 weeks, where they do a daily hour of stretching. And they even kind of tease that out. They tried to compare 2 hours versus 1 hour, didn't see a significant difference in one of their methods papers. And then they did a series of studies on the calves on these 1 hour differences. They compared it versus normal resistance training. They compared men versus women. They compared a non-stretch leg versus stretch leg, and consistently observed these pretty large effects that are on par with resistance training. But the thing to remember is that in the study where they compared resistance training, they were doing like 15 sets per week, which took them less than an hour, versus an hour per day of stretching a calf, you know? So the time efficiency to get to the same place in terms of the actual change in muscle thickness is way skewed off. Like, yes, this works, but the question is, like, is it even worthwhile if you could just do resistance training? So then the question is, well, is this potentially complementary? Is it synergistic, or is it redundant? Are they both getting you to the same thing? And the case study that I did might indicate perhaps that they could be complementary, considering I was already resistance training. It wasn't a redundant stimulus. And while we haven't really figured out what the stimulus is, to go back to what I said earlier, there are some plausible ways that we could see this as potentially different from resistance training. So for one, you're not contracting, right? So you're getting into a very deep passive stretch. And the first thing you'll notice is that you start to go numb, you start to experience pain. And what's happening when you stretch a muscle to that degree and it's flattening out, it's actually occluding the vascularity, the vasculature. So you're getting this hypoxic effect that may be of a long enough length and duration that it is providing some type of stimulus akin to BFR. Another thing to consider is that it is putting you in a stretch position, and there is some mechanosensing of that. So that could be something going on. And in the studies on animals, they actually did observe substantial hyperplasia. So for those who are not aware, hypertrophy is the increase in muscle diameter of individual myofibers. And it is not the addition of new muscle cells. Hyperplasia is the addition of new muscle cells. So they're basically something that is rare and requires a very high stimulus. And this may be a unique enough stimulus to actually do that. It seems to be the case in animal models. So there's a few ways that possibly this long duration, high intensity, high frequency static stretching could be producing hypertrophy that is different or potentially complementary to resistance training. What the optimal combination and dose of the two, whether it's worth it, whether you want to sit on your ass in a boot, if that's, how much Netflix do you want to watch? And also, how do we do this for other muscle groups? That is still an open question. And I think we haven't gotten there yet. And I will say, though, that you're probably getting some of that mechanism when you're doing length and partials, but probably not nearly the same. I do think we trend towards thinking of things in like, what's the silver bullet? What's the singular cause of this? What is the singular mechanism? Because that's the way human brains work. But that's not the way evolutionary biology works. We're built on redundant systems. We're much more like NASA creating a spacecraft. They know something's going to fail, so we want to have 5 different fail safes. That's why you can have a genetic disease that prevents, say, certain forms of glycogen synthase, but we still have a way to live. Or, we may not have, the ability to produce much of this enzyme, but we're okay if we do that. So you will often see in the human body that it has a lot of different ways to get from point A to point B. And if you stop one, it's got a backup. So I do think that the length and partial training or training at longer muscle lengths is most likely going to be found to have multiple mechanisms that it's maximizing to enhance growth rather than one singular mechanism. And I think one probably minor player is spending more time in that stretch position. But it can't be a major player, because if you think about it, if it takes an hour per day to kind of maximize the practical stimulus, you doing 12 sets per week in the lengthened position, even if you're pausing at the bottom, that's just a fraction of the time spent in that deep stretch position compared to actually stretching. So probably part of it, but it probably has more to do with some type of active contraction in the stretch position, not just the passive ability to be in that position and stretch.
Man, that's a lot of interesting points. You already alluded to it, but I wanted to ask, do you think you were doing 20 weekly sets for your calves But let's say the way you expose yourself to more tension is through more sets. Obviously, if you can recover, if you can adapt, you can progress. Let's say you did that instead of going with the device. Do you think the different mechanisms involved in whether it's resistance training or in the device are so different that it will be a different response that you got rather than training more sets as long as you progress in for that muscle group? I don't know if I'm being
Now,
kind of
no,
putting
I
it.
get you. And I honestly don't know. That is a great question. You know, could we have just gotten to the same place with more sets? Um, I tell you what, though, when I'm doing 20 sets and stretching that much, I could tell that I was riding the line of like what mechanically can my tendon and feet handle. Um, and I think this is something people be cautious with because you will be getting wear and tear, and there does need to be some recovery. And I think honestly, it's it's hard to say because we don't know the mechanisms, but I don't know that I could have handled more than say 25, 30 sets. And the first time I tried to stretch, I only lasted 20 minutes, you know? So I tried it 6 weeks before we actually started the study just to see like how does this go? It's kind of like a familiarization session, if you will. And I was like, oh my God, how am I going to make it an hour? And and I had to like play video games at first, like be distracted, like watch, like it gets quite painful. About 20 minutes in, it kind of hits peak pain, and then your leg goes numb and it gets better, and then you start getting like the tingles, like the pins and needles, and then that lasts for another 30 minutes, so it definitely increased my pain tolerance. It did get better over time, but the problem is each time it gets better, then you tighten it down to get back to that 8 out of 10 pain sensation. And I actually exceeded the amount of overlap you can get on the Velcro. So by the end of it, what I had was I had to clamp it down to because there was no more overlap on the
Yeah.
on the Velcro, and then those weren't strong enough because your foot's like you're creating more and more elastic tension, like you're pulling back a rubber band. So I was taking these tacks and then putting them through the two things. So I have like all these tacks and clamps to keep it in place. So it got pretty jerry rigged, man. It was pretty goofy, but I was doing the damn thing. I was like, all right, I got to get back to an 8 out of 10 pain sensation. And eventually I was just getting to the point where I just couldn't stretch my calf anymore. And it was still pretty painful, but I was just like the most I could possibly do each time. So it's not the most practical intervention. Let's put it that way. And I think the interesting thing is that there is definitely like this diminishing dose response. There is some data that Wernicke did where they used like a calf block. So it's kind of just like a wedge and you stand backwards on it. So it stretches you into dorsiflexion. And they didn't look at hypertrophy in that study, but they did 15 minutes a day in athletes who couldn't get access to the gym during COVID. And they would just stand on this calf block and stretch at an 8 out of 10 pain sensation for 15 minutes a day. So 1/4 of the amount of time, much more practical, doesn't require a boot. And they actually saw improvements in performance. So their jump height improved and their isometric calf strength improved. And typically you see that improve in concert with hypertrophy. So I do suspect that if someone wanted to give this a try, they could do something like holding an extreme stretch, so 8 out of 10 pain sensation daily for 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever they could handle, and doing that as a complement to their training. And they might be able to find kind of like that practical limit of what they can do. But an important caveat is that this does produce fatigue. Another study that Wernicke did was they compared calf raises to stretching in a boot for an hour, and both of them resulted in a decrease in force production that took a while to come back, just like training. We know that training will acutely disrupt the muscle. It'll reduce your force production. It'll result in delayed onset muscle soreness. Extreme stretching does as well. So I think it's really just important to understand that this isn't a cost-free trial. So like if you're like, you know what, I got a day off on Wednesday, let me do some extreme stretching for my quads for 20, 30 minutes a piece, then I'll just, no problem. And then I got squats on Thursday. It's going to go poorly. You'll basically have been training your quads 2 days in a row. So this is probably something to do post-exercise, absolutely not immediately pre-exercise. And you also need to account for the fact that it's going to cause some muscle damage and fatigue that will last a similar length to a hard training session.
And that's actually a good segue. I'm not kidding this time about muscle damage and how to actually at least incorporate for most of us that don't have access to a device, and also the commitment that you did, man, because that's quite the time investment and also all the things that you have to do to keep on the 8 out of 10. So how can we, with all this data, with all the meta-analysis, and I'm sure a lot to come, I think it's worth giving it a shot. Milos en español, in Milo's words, maybe we're not gonna lose anything, and there's a possibility that we can get a little bit more hypertrophy. So I think it's worth giving it a shot. But then we have to face the question: how do I actually incorporate this to my program? How is the muscle damage gonna differ if I do a full run? How can I take that into account? And in which exercises? Because, like you mentioned, we can perhaps do it in a squat, but maybe a free weight squat would be not the best option. So how can we integrate all of this really interesting data, and again, more to come, into a real program?
Great question. Yeah, exercise selection becomes paramount. And the first thing I would say is that as far as a bang for your buck, also, do we have enough data in different populations, different muscle groups, trained and untrained perspective? Length and partials, or training at longer muscle lengths, are probably the two ways that are most feasible and most supported by the data. So, for example, there's some easy ways to implement this that doesn't even require huge changes. If you're used to doing, say, dumbbell lateral raises, where there's really no tension at the bottom when the delta is in lengthened position and only gets hard at the top, simply switch to cables, you know. And then if you really want to enhance it a little bit more, put the cable kind of behind your contralateral glute or next to your contralateral hip, and you're kind of pulling across your body. So, you know, you're doing a cable lateral raise starting from here or even behind your body here, right?
Right.
So you're getting more range of motion. You're in a more you've created more tension, and there's immediate tension, which you're probably not used to if you're primarily doing dumbbell lateral raises. Another way of thinking about this would be a fly. You know, you could do cable crossovers instead. So there's, you know, tension at the start, and there's not that point, although that's in a shortened position, doesn't matter quite as much. Or you could do it Arnold style, pumping iron. You see that he doesn't come all the way up, so he actually does length and partial dumbbell flies. You know, just keeping it in that more stretched position. Another one is right from that mouse study. If you've got access to it, do seated leg curls, right? Just be aware that if you want that sartorius to grow as well, you probably do want to do some other exercises and maybe switch between the two. Another one I really like is actually a single leg standing cable leg extension. So this requires a cuff that is pretty sturdy with a ring that you have facing the back of your ankle. And then you bring the cable stack down to about hip height and you clip it on the back of your foot. You hold either the thing above you or the cable stack in front of you, and you're doing standing leg extensions. So since this is a visual medium, I can actually kind of show what the hell I'm talking about. Is you basically have, you know, this guy behind you here, and you're doing a leg extension towards the ground while you stabilize yourself. It takes twice as long. It's unilateral, but it's a very effective stimulus specifically for the rectus femoris, because out of all the four heads of the quadricep, it crosses the hip. So when you're not in hip flexion, not seated, when you're standing, that is getting more of a stretch. So those actually,
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say that I'm actually doing that variation because I recall another study that they had this leg extension that they can go all the way back. So I saw actually how you did it with the cable. Gave it a shot. Feels great. I don't know if it's more hypertrophy rather than the leg extension in the seated machine, but at least in terms of sensations and the way I can progress it, it's pretty nice, man.
Yeah, it's a good movement. I do it at home because I have a home gym. It's great if you don't have access to actual machine. And the first time I did it, I got really sore, like kind of in the upper middle portion of my quad. And I'm someone who does leg extensions normally quite frequently. So I wouldn't expect it. And I could feel basically my rectus femoris getting delayed onset muscle soreness. So it certainly provided a stimulus and produced fatigue. It would be good to have a study on that, but we do have other studies to make me think that it probably would be applicable. So those are easy ways where you're not even doing a length and partial. You're just modifying exercises. Another way to go is they're rare, but there's some machines where you can adjust, or they're built to emphasize a lengthened position. So for example, just yesterday I trained at the YMCA here, and they have a hoist machine where the initial part of the row is like really hard, and then it gets easier as you get to your chest, which is the opposite of a free weight row or most even just cable rows. And that's great because now you're basically able to overload the lengthened position. So that's another way to do it, where it's just choosing the right machine. So this is all like the I don't have to think kind of like foolproof way of ensuring you're getting more tension at the lengthened position. But the research-based application of what Milo's actually doing is essentially just not doing the final portion of the range of motion when you're in a shortened position. So if you were going to do a chest press machine, and machines are very good for this, you just do the first half or the first 2/3 or the first third. And you just kind of think about a nice landmark. Easy way to do it is just to kind of come to the point when you're at a 90-degree angle with your elbow and your forearm and your upper arm for pressing movements, and you come back down. And you do your sets in the same way you normally would. You just basically cut off the top range of motion. And I think it's really interesting that bodybuilders have been doing this intuitively for a long time, just because they feel more disruption and feel a better pump. They feel like they get better outcomes. If you ever watch Ronnie Coleman train, for an example, just because I recently visited him, his shoulder presses comes up to about here. His chest presses, he comes to about here. You know, his squats, he doesn't do the top fourth of the motion, doesn't lock it out. You know, so same thing with, you know, and lat pull downs. They use a lot of momentum through the early part, and they load it up heavier than they can. These are kind of less refined ways of doing it. They're probably not ideal, but that's kind of what you find out from anecdotal experience. What works, not necessarily why it works. So this is refining some of that. Now we figured out, okay, why does it work? All right, so maybe I don't actually want to use momentum to get through that early phase. Maybe I just need to load it up heavier and then just not complete the last portion where I pull that to my chest. So yeah, lengthened partials are great, but for certain movements you can imagine they would be dangerous. So like free weight pressing, free weight squats, what happens if you fail? You're stuck at the bottom. That's not where you want to be. So Smith machine can be a very good friend for these. Machines can be very good friends, and so can cables. And you'd be surprised with how little experience and time it takes to just kind of get used to a certain partial range. I've been doing pretty much all of my hypertrophy work with these techniques for the last 6 months now. I kind of started doing at the beginning of prep. I was doing lengthened partials for most of my exercises. You know, come up halfway on your bicep curl, you go halfway down on triceps. You know, if it's not movement that I use to enhance my powerlifting performance, which does require full range of motion, I'm typically doing a lengthened partial or a variation which accentuates the lengthened position, because I'm relatively well convinced by the data. And I know worst case scenario, even if a bunch of studies start coming out showing, oh, this isn't the case, it's actually not better than full range, I would be incredibly surprised if it was worse than full range, because that's not the way any of the data is leaning. And even with sampling variance, I just think that's incredibly unlikely. So, you know, worst case scenario, 5 years from now, we go, oh, well, we overhyped that a little bit, but it's no worse. So no time wasted, right?
Yeah, totally. And like, for instance, let's say for a bodybuilder that we don't need to go to the top of a deadlift, let's say, on which exercise do you think would be most appropriate to do partials? Maybe an RDL, because the danger is not really there. You just drop the bar, make a scandal, and that's it. Or in a leg curl machine, whether if it's seated or lying down. Do you think this is an interesting consideration, or perhaps it's just down to personal preference?
Yeah, I think some exercises are just logistically more challenging. So I've done RDLs and even conventional deadlifts partial using the bottom. The issue is you don't really get a chance to breathe, you know? So the intuitive thing you'll do when you do an RDL or a deadlift is lock out and take a breath every 2 or 3 reps while you're doing your kind of natural Valsalva where you're holding your breath. But when you're doing a lengthened partial, you're staying in the position where that lever arm is furthest and you need to brace. So you're just like, when do I breathe? And what you end up doing is doing like 3 reps, resting the bar on the ground, taking a breath, doing 3 reps, resting the bar on the ground. So it becomes, some exercises feel the same, like you're just not completing the rep. And some exercises feel like totally new exercises. In the deadlift, to me, and RDL are a couple of those examples. Same with squats or leg presses. You're kind of, I think this is a good training experience because you realize where in ranges of motion you're resting. So we all get this intuitively on squats. We know we stop at the top, take a few big deep breaths, and go again. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's okay to pace yourself, especially if the goal is performance, not hypertrophy. But it is a far more intense experience to kind of stay in the quote unquote pocket at the bottom of a leg press, just barely coming up. You know, like you feel like you're getting crushed at the bottom of a leg press. You feel like you're getting crushed the whole set when you do a lengthened partial set on a leg press. And you have to do things like, okay, I'm going to set the stoppers on the Smith machine or the stoppers on the leg press at a point where if I do get stuck and I fail there, that I'm safe, I can get out from underneath it. So that's why I wouldn't recommend it on like free weight squats or a leg press when you're not thinking about where the bottom range is. So you do have to be safety minded, and you will also experience a little more DOMs. So I think if you want to start doing this, don't convert all of your training over immediately. Take like one exercise per muscle group at a time, and then just do them like that. So, you know, you've got 3 or 4 chest exercises that you do throughout the week. Start this off, just do one of them as a lengthened partial. Same thing for each and every muscle group, and see how you go. Wait till the DOMS comes back to kind of a normal recovery arc, and then you can start converting things over. And again, there is such a thing as a maximal stimulus you can get in any given period of time. So don't think you even need to convert it all over. If you've got a really great program, it's probably producing 80, 90% of what you can possibly get. So tweak it a little bit, and don't make the whole thing, you know, harder, because it might be too much. And then you're actually dealing with needing to restructure your whole training protocol because the stimulus is too high. You know, the amount of volume we do, the proximity to failure, that's a balancing act. It's not like, oh, I saw a study or I heard someone say training to failure is better, so I'm always going to train to failure on every exercise. It's, oh, okay, where can I fit in failure training to enhance my stimulus to the point where it won't take it too far? Or then you have to change other things. Like, oh, I started doing lengthened partials, I started training to failure, and I maintained my set volume of 20 sets per week. Well, that might even be worse. You might have to come down to 15 or 16. And that's going to, you know, vary by each individual. There is no cookie cutter. So this is potentially going to increase the complexity of your decision making. So do it one thing at a time, so you don't end up kind of getting in the middle of a very complex web of interacting variables and you don't know what you need to change. And then monitor your results. So to kind of take a lesson from the science crew. You know, we modify one variable at a time and we see if it worked. So if you start getting better gains from doing a couple of your exercises, lengthened partials, just keep doing that until it stops working. You know, don't just keep going just because you listen to this IG Live.
Right, and just to finish off on, as always, be respectful of your time. I've seen Dr. Pak doing this and mentioned, you already alluded to this. It's not the same, the proximity to failure, let's say in a row, in a machine row, in a lengthened position, than if you were to do the complete repetition. So perhaps if your definition of proximity to failure, it's speaking of this, but in a lengthened position, you can still do more reps. That kind of changes a little bit of the training itself, right?
Absolutely. And that is another potential application. And I think this makes more sense to do it on like your last exercise of the day. So let's say you've got a back day and you've got a lat pull down, you've got a lat pull over, and then you've got a row variation. And the row variation is a cable row, just like you said, and you're done. You know, like even if you are starting the lengthened partial and you only pull to the point where your elbow's next to your body, you could probably do more reps where your elbow's, you know, for there,
Yeah,
and then there, and then there, and then there. So maybe on your last set of rows, you go until you can barely bend your elbow. So, you know, you're doing an extra 5-6 reps past the point where you would have hit failure on even a lengthened partial, which is, you know, way past the point where you hit it with a full range of motion. And that's the really interesting thing you start to realize is there's probably certain muscle groups that have been quote unquote neglected by the way we train with a full range of motion more than others. So some of the traditional exercises, they're probably not going to see major additions in muscle mass gains if you try this, like your pressing exercises and your squatting exercises, because a squat is already hard in the hole, right? The limiting factor is the hole, and it gets really easy at the top. So you're not expending a lot of energy going from, you know, mostly locked out to locked out on squat. You're actually resting, right? And then you're going to get stuck somewhere in the bottom, you know, where people fail squats. Same thing with bench press, same thing with shoulder press. But where there is a potential for this to work are some of the muscle groups or the pulling exercise, where I think we're going to see the most change. Because if you have a very strict interpretation, it's okay, I'm going to keep my back straight, do a cable row, and a rep only counts if I can touch, you know, my wrist to the sides of my rib cage. And then if I'm an inch away, nope, I'm done, right? The reality is if you went from here to here to here to here to here to here to here, those reps, as we know from the length and partial data, are probably just as effective as the ones that are actually close to your body. So you're actually kind of like the equivalent of comparing like a 6 RIR to a 0 RIR, right? So I think for the back, this can be a game changer for people. And we've got some anecdotal experiences that back that up. For example, Alberto Nunez's season last year was after he was doing a couple of years of training like this for his back. And very notably, his back thickness and width improved. I've seen some minor improvements in my delts in my back from doing this because I used to only do dumbbell lateral raises. And my calves have, so basically if there's improvements in my physique, it's a little bit in the calves, probably due to stretching, and a little bit in the delts and a little bit in certain poses in my back. I think the thickness more than the width, which is unfortunately just my structure. But yeah, I think an easy way to do this, if this is too complicated or if it's too much of a change all at once, if you're a little more conservative, is for your last exercise for a given muscle group on a given day is kind of do a quote unquote burnout, where you keep going until you can no longer even get 1/3 of the range of motion. There was a good Jeff Nippard video not too long ago where he did basically leg curls until, like, you'd normally stop until your heel doesn't touch your hamstring. And then he just kept going, kept going, kept going, kept going, kept going. And he got like another, 6 or 7 reps, I want to say, past the point of traditional failure. And you'd have to think, based upon this data, that might be a little bit better. But it's also a ton more fatigue. And that's always the balancing act. So it's not something that just convert over everything all of a sudden, because now we learn something about muscle length and we go, oh, well, that changes the rules for failure. No, it doesn't. Like, you still got to keep that in mind. So if you do more sets at a lengthened position, you're going to get more muscle damage. If you do more reps in total, you're going to get more muscle damage. It's more volume. And then if you are also going closer to failure, you're going to get more muscle damage. So you don't want to get to the point where you have to reduce your overall volume or frequency of training because you're using these implements, and you might be washing out any beneficial effect you have. But it might be that 12 sets of lengthened partials and training in that lengthened position are better than 15 sets, but I'd be surprised if they're better than like 24, right? So you kind of have to think about where that inception point is, where the kind of the two lines cross, and you're getting the best combination of, I would call this like an intensity technique, if you would, and volume.
Yeah, I think it's let's say wise to think about all of this as a spectrum, as a threshold that we need to reach with intensity, with volume, even with range of motion. I used to stress a lot, well, not a lot, I mean, not like I'm going crazy over it. Let's say pull-ups. If my chest didn't touch, it doesn't count and whatever. But then when I begin to see less range of motion, now I think, oh, okay, so I'm in the zone.
Yep.
And also not thinking that I need to keep going because, failure and the recent study, about failure and all of that, that there's a reason for me to keep going, but also there's not a reason for me to stress if the range of motion is not, let's say, complete, for instance.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think it's just really interesting. Some people are wondering, why is the lengthened partial better? And it's important to note that even though that shortened position doesn't produce as much stimulus, it is challenging. And in certain exercises, it's disproportionately challenging. So for example, to fully lock out a calf raise from like here to here takes a ton of energy. And imagine if you just never did that portion, all that energy you expended to lock out your calf raises could be given towards getting more reps in that bottom position, which is inherently more stimulative. Hence why you see the slightly better outcomes. It's not a major difference either. It is a significant and meaningful change, but it's not like massively huge. Some studies it is, but I would suspect the overall effect size would be like moderate, comparing lengthened partials versus full range of motion training. Now, if you're doing shortened partials, it's way worse. Full range of motion training and lengthened partials are way better. So if you're doing half squats, if you're not touching your chest on bench press, just doing these shoulder presses up here, then that's kind of the thing that you do probably want to stay away from. But yeah, 100%. This is a strategy that can be useful. And if you understand that, you understand why spending more of your energy in the lengthened position can be better. And yeah, it does seem to apply to almost every single exercise we've seen. Kubo, deep squats versus partial squats, better growth. We got Mao, conference abstract, partial range, multi-hip versus in lengthened position versus full range, better glute growth. We've got arm studies, we got quad studies, we got hamstring studies. So it's hard to study things like the lats and the delts, but I suspect those would follow suit as well. And yeah, it's something that I would encourage people just to experiment with. Very little downside, and it is a bit of a skill. It is a different way of training and thinking about it, and it will take a little bit of time, but it makes it fun too. It's a new rock to turn over.
Yeah, totally. And we also have Ronnie's old videos where he does this range of motion that you mentioned. So do we really need more studies, more evidence? I mean, there's Ronnie. We can ask Ronnie.
I mean, honestly, all science ever does is just prove bodybuilders right. Am I right, bro? Come on.
Yeah, it's starting to look like the bros on that were kind of right. So, I mean, we're going to go back to the old school.
That's right. Science is pointless.
Yeah. My man, just one final comment that I wanted to mention. I did listen to ID and Abilities. I listened to a song that was about the guy turning into a fish and being in a fish.
Yes.
And I was like, wow, this is so abstract. How keep up something with this stuff, man? So I just wanted to mention it before we say goodbye, man.
Yeah, that is one of his best songs, man.
Yes.
That's he's dope. R.I.P. man. I'm glad you actually tracked him down and listened. I thought you'd appreciate that.
For sure. Hip hop heads.
My man.
So anyway, I don't want to take any more of your time. As you already know, I'm here to remind you. You're more than welcome, my man. And again, for anyone interested, we have más. Tenemos más disponible en español. Links in the description again. Thanks for taking the time, man. It's always a pleasure, always a privilege to get to talk to you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, man. Much appreciate your time.
Have a great day, man.
You too, brother. Take care.
See you there.